What I'm about to tell you happened in a tunnel that had been sealed since 1944, and trust me, there's a reason some places should stay buried forever. I don't usually get paired with anyone for these underground survey jobs, which honestly suits me perfectly. People are fine in small doses, but I'm absolutely terrible at small talk and eye contact. I always seem to miss the punchlines in conversations. My colleagues say I have the social instincts of a damp traffic cone, but I've learned to embrace what I love. I'm passionate about boring wartime history that nobody under 60 cares about anymore. I've learned not to bring up these topics unless someone is very bored, very polite, or already halfway through a Scotch egg so they can't tell me to shut up. The job was straightforward: a disused railway tunnel flagged under the South Cut Clearance Survey. Nobody had set foot inside since 1944, and when something's been sealed that long, you never know what horrors you're walking into. The railway company sent me with Dan, a guy in his early 20s. He was one of those young workers who couldn't function without his AirPods, constantly vaping and providing running commentary on UFC fights. It wasn't my usual preference for solitude, but I've survived worse companions. I once spent an entire week on the Carl line with someone who genuinely thought Dunkirk was in Germany. Our mission was simple: log any debris, test the structural clearances, and determine if the place was safe enough to reopen for public use in the summer. If everything looked promising, they'd send in a proper restoration team. If not, they'd demolish it and pretend it never existed. We arrived at the tunnel entrance just past 5 in the morning, fully equipped with safety gear, respirators, tool bags, and emergency radios. The entrance was secured with heavy-gauge chain-link fencing, 2 layers deep, backed by timber boards and a padlock the size of your fist. It looked like someone had attacked it with bolt cutters at some point, though it had been clumsily patched up afterward. Above the entrance, the original cast iron arch loomed overhead, rusted and stamped with a wartime engineering mark that you'd miss unless you knew exactly what to look for. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because your support gives incredible strength to this channel. And don't forget to check the description for details about our exclusive giveaway contest that's running right now. Once we cracked open the venting system and slipped inside, we immediately clicked on our powerful torches, both beams cutting sharp lines through the misty darkness. The air hit us hard once we ventured far enough into the depths. Even with our professional respirators, breathing felt like licking the inside of an old, rusty kettle. Every single step we took stirred up clouds of ancient dust that had been undisturbed for decades. Dan glanced around nervously and muttered, "Bit grim in here." "Yeah," I replied. "Can't imagine coming in here without proper respirators." "Have you ever heard of the Cross Line?" I asked him casually. Dan shook his head with confusion. "Is that like a brand name or something?" "No, that's the actual name of the railway line this tunnel was originally part of," I explained. "They used it during the war to move crucial supplies between coastal depots and the Royal Air Force sites. Mostly heavy crates, aviation fuel, and the occasional medical unit. In March 1944, they caught a devastating Luftwaffe airstrike at the southern tunnel mouth, just as a supply train had broken down deep inside." Dan's voice came out quiet over the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the gravel ballast. "Never heard of that particular wartime incident," he said with genuine interest. "The massive blast created a deadly vacuum effect," I continued, perhaps speaking too enthusiastically about such a grim subject. "It sucked a roaring fireball straight down the entire length of the tunnel while the crew was still desperately trying to fix the broken train." "Whoa," Dan responded with shock. "Were there any survivors from that disaster?" I gave a dry, matter-of-fact shrug. The entire place would have been charred end to end by the time the fire finally burned itself out. With another railway line still operational and a world war to fight, they didn't bother with any recovery crew. They simply sealed it up and moved on to more pressing military matters. Dan stayed completely quiet after hearing that story, his boots crunching steadily beside mine as we continued deeper. I didn't say anything else either, sensing the mood had shifted. After several long minutes, he cleared his throat and started muttering about some featherweight bout he'd watched the previous weekend. It seemed like he couldn't bear the oppressive silence any longer. He said the fighter came in underweight but still managed to drop his opponent in the second round with a perfectly executed spinning elbow. He called it an absolute belter with genuine enthusiasm. I nodded gratefully for the mood change, even though I had absolutely no clue who he was talking about. It wasn't long after that conversation when we started noticing clear signs that the tunnel had sustained structural damage over the years. Several ceiling plates were cracked and broken, with rusted bolts hanging dangerously loose overhead. There was a shallow pile of crumbled brick near one of the electrical cable housings that looked more recent than the surrounding wartime damage. Nothing immediately structural or dangerous, but definitely enough to keep your eyes peeled for potential hazards. Then we started discovering scattered pieces of torn fabric, mostly oily and ground deep into the gravel ballast. There was one particular piece twisted tightly under a heavy bolt that looked like canvas material, only significantly thinner and more deteriorated. I gave it a cautious nudge with my steel-toed boot. "What do you think that fabric is?" Dan asked with obvious concern. "Could be a leftover sleeve from one of the poor souls they sealed up in here," I replied. Dan stared at me for a long beat with wide eyes. "You're joking, right?" he asked nervously. "Of course I am," I said, half laughing at his reaction. "It's probably just a bit of coat from some urban explorer who is trespassing and poking around where they shouldn't have been. Does look pretty weird though, I had to admit. Should handle this properly," Dan muttered with professional concern. "Stuff like this can easily trip someone up if they don't see it in the darkness. It's a proper safety hazard if it's sticking up like that." He crouched down over the fabric and examined it carefully with his thick work glove. "Feels really strange," he said with confusion. "It's much tougher than I was expecting. Not normal fabric at all." "All right," I said while watching him pull out a multi-tool from his equipment bag. "I'll continue logging the next tunnel segment up ahead. The main junction box should be located just past that sharp bend." I tapped the emergency radio clipped securely to my chest. "Stay on channel 4 for communication." "Yeah," Dan replied. "Shout if you need anything urgent, or if that fabric starts acting all haunted or something. If it does much of anything supernatural, I'm definitely legging it out of here," he said with nervous laughter. "Fair play," I responded, and continued walking deeper ahead into the oppressive darkness. The tunnel seemed to swallow me up completely as I ventured further from Dan's position. Each step I took pulled the stale air thicker and more oppressive around me. It felt damp and stagnant, like breathing the breath of something that had been sleeping for decades. Every 20 or 30 yards, there was a refuge bay built specifically for railway workers to duck into when trains would thunder past. I developed a habit of counting these bays methodically to help pass the increasingly tense time. Just after the 8th bay, I spotted the unmistakable glint of twisted, blackened steel. It was the completely gutted husk of what had once been a freight wagon. My heart actually gave a genuine little thump of excitement and dread. This was the actual supply train from the Crossline story I'd just finished telling Dan about. The wagon was absolutely gutted and half melted across the railway tracks in a grotesque display. One entire axle had folded completely in on itself from the intense heat, and most of the metal siding was completely gone. It had been peeled back like opening a tin of Spam, leaving jagged, twisted metal edges. What remained of the structure was heavily pitted with decades of rust and speckled with the droppings of whatever bats or birds had managed to sneak inside over the years. My torch beam played methodically over the twisted wreckage, and I caught disturbing hints of singed fabric that had been fused directly into the metal rivets. There were also the unmistakable remains of melted boot soles stuck permanently beneath the wheel assembly. I felt simultaneously giddy with historical excitement, then immediately grim about the human tragedy this represented. Then there was movement in the shadows just beyond the wreck. Something had definitely disturbed the loose gravel ballast in the darkness ahead. I froze completely, my torch beam fixed dead ahead, heart hammering in my chest. At first, I assumed it was just a piece of debris settling naturally, but just where my light couldn't quite reach, I noticed a dark shape moving slowly and jerkily. It was dragging itself laboriously from the far side of the destroyed carriage. Initially, I thought some homeless person had somehow found a way inside and chosen this place for temporary shelter. I wouldn't have blamed them honestly. It was reasonably dry and completely quiet. "You can't be here, mate," I called out with authority. "There are hazardous conditions down here you need to clear off immediately. I won't report you to anyone. Just get out now for your own safety." That was precisely when the figure shifted directly into my bright torch light. The first thing I noticed with absolute horror was that it looked like this thing was wearing someone else's skin, or at least attempting to. Chunks of human flesh clung to its frame in a grotesque patchwork. It appeared as if it had torn skin free in a violent frenzy and slapped the pieces over itself without any care for proper fit. I could make out bits of torso, what looked like a forearm, and part of a human thigh. The rest of the creature was completely raw. A blistered patchwork of wet red tissue and exposed veins that looked like overrun electrical wires. I staggered backward hard, my boots skidding dangerously over the loose ballast, and landed heavily like a sack of bricks. My torch slipped from my trembling grip, skittering and clattering across the gravel before landing several feet in front of me. Its bright beam was now fixed squarely on the horrific creature. I didn't dare go for the torch. Absolutely not. Instead, I turned and bolted at full speed, my heart hammering violently, feet slipping repeatedly over the loose stone ballast. I threw myself desperately into the nearest refuge bay and crouched low in the protective darkness, my breath catching and snagging painfully in my throat. I stayed completely silent, straining to listen for any approaching footsteps, until I realized with growing horror that the texture under my knee wasn't the expected stone ballast. Whatever I was kneeling on was sticky and tacky, adhering unpleasantly to my work trousers. I reached carefully for my phone and illuminated the lock screen. The pale glow spilled over torn human flesh scattered around the refuge bay. Skin was missing in wet, irregular flaps. Chunks of it had been peeled and cut off messily, exposing glistening muscle tissue and slashed tendons underneath. It was immediately clear that the creature, or whatever that thing was, had been skinning people and doing it in this exact location. My hand shook violently as I cut the phone light and pressed my back hard against the cold stone wall. Every single inch of my body was wound tight with pure panic, but I didn't dare move or breathe too loudly. I strained desperately to listen for any sign that the creature had heard me hiding, but there was only a faint sound of metal clinking and some sort of disturbing sloshing noise. I shifted forward just enough to risk a careful glance around the bay's protective edge and saw that the creature was completely caught on heavy steel cabling that had somehow fused directly into its raw flesh. The cables carved deep, wet gouges through the meat of its legs where the metal had melted into its body during some past incident. Every desperate tug sent a fresh, violent jerk through its entire twisted frame. It tried repeatedly to move forward, but the integrated cabling kept dragging it inexorably back. As absolutely horrific as the sight was, I felt a twisted jolt of genuine relief because it meant the creature physically couldn't reach my hiding position. I crept forward on all fours as slowly as I could possibly manage, keeping my eyes fixed directly on the struggling monster. It was still jerking violently, still fighting desperately against the restraining cables, its raw legs dragging forward in short, agonized bursts. I kept moving cautiously until my trembling fingers found my fallen torch and closed around it securely. Just as I was carefully shimmying away from the creature, my emergency radio suddenly lit up with static. South Cove Control. This is Red Lead. Enemy overhead. Repeat. Enemy aircraft sighted. Brace for immediate impact. The transmission was tiny and heavily distorted by static interference. The creature jerked much harder in response to the unexpected sound. It threw itself forward with a raspy scream that echoed through the tunnel. Its limbs stretched at sickeningly unnatural angles as the steel cabling bit even deeper, and it tore completely through its own raw meat in a frenzy to reach me. That sudden burst of violent activity completely broke my nerve. I turned and ran at absolute full sprint, torch clutched tight, breath slicing in short, panicked gasps that burst through my respirator mask. Then Dan's familiar voice filtered through the radio static, crackling with interference. Callum, mate." I heard him breathing fast and shallow, like he was desperately trying not to be heard by something. "Something's here. I can't." His transmission cut off abruptly. I fumbled desperately for my radio with shaking hands. "Dan, I'm on my way back. Just hold on and don't move. Whatever's down here with us, it's not right. Just come back. Come back to me now." Another burst of heavy static erupted from the radio, then complete silence with no reply. I ran harder, trying desperately to keep my bearings while every bone in my body begged me to look back and see if I was being pursued. I knew logically that the first creature hadn't gotten free from the cables. I hadn't heard it following behind me, but my body didn't care about logic. I couldn't stop my mind from imagining it hunting me down through the darkness. Every step felt painfully too slow, and I wanted nothing more than to grab Dan and escape from this nightmare tunnel immediately. When I finally reached the location where I'd left Dan working, his tool bag was still sitting exactly where he'd placed it. There was absolutely no sign of Dan himself anywhere. My torch beam flickered frantically across the tunnel walls until it caught on a narrow maintenance tunnel branching off to the side. It was half choked with accumulated dust and looked barely wide enough for a person. I stepped toward the maintenance entrance, my heart hammering violently, torch held tight in my sweaty grip. "Dan! Dan!" I called out, cursing myself internally for not just booking it out of the tunnel alone and abandoning him. Then I saw a figure hunched over near the far wall of the narrow maintenance tunnel. It was breathing in shallow, labored rasps with its back turned toward me. The shoulders were twitching erratically like the person was about to vomit violently. "Dan," I said again, much lower this time to avoid attracting attention. I saw something horrific down by the wreck. It was wearing someone's skin, or something equally disturbing. I don't know exactly what it was, but we need to get out now before it finds us. As I got closer to the hunched figure, I realized with growing dread that the skin along the spine looked torn and unnaturally stretched. The proportions were completely wrong, too broad in the shoulders and far too long in the extended limbs. I realized with absolute horror that this was another one of those skin creatures, and this one had done a significantly better job of disguising itself than the first. The thing shifted position, turning toward me with fluid, inhuman movement. Dan's familiar face twitched grotesquely as the creature twisted its elongated neck at an impossible angle. It straightened up to its full, unnatural height and lunged directly toward me with predatory intent. My boots skidded desperately as I tore back through the main tunnel, torchlight bouncing wildly off soot-stained walls and crumbling stone. I could hear its irregular footfalls pounding and scraping against the gravel ballast as it chased me relentlessly. The distant mouth of the tunnel appeared ahead like salvation, a thin slice of precious morning light calling like a lifeline to safety. I charged at full tilt toward the exit, shoulder-checking the security gate as I hit it with my full body weight. The chain link rattled violently, hinges groaning in protest as the gate gave way under my desperate momentum. I burst into blessed daylight and spun around immediately, grabbing for the edge of the gate and trying to haul it closed behind me. But I wasn't nearly fast enough. The creature was right behind me. The service train we'd taken to reach the site sat several dozen yards down the main track. I vaulted up the metal step and scrambled inside desperately, my boots thudding against the metal floor. I turned to see if the creature had followed me outside just in time to watch it slam through the gate, with its limbs flailing wildly. The second its exposed flesh met the direct morning sunlight, it shrieked in absolute agony. The raw tissue immediately began sizzling and blistering, splitting apart as steam hissed from beneath what remained of Dan's stolen skin. The creature stumbled backward, jerking and convulsing violently in the bright light. What was left of Dan's face sagged sideways, folding unnaturally at the edges like melting wax. Then it reeled back in obvious pain, flailing desperately as it crawled in reverse, dragging itself back into the protective darkness of the tunnel. I stood there panting heavily, hands braced against the inside wall of the train carriage for support. I shakily tore the respirator mask off my face and sucked in the cold morning air in deep, frantic gulps. My heart was still lodged firmly in my throat, and every muscle in my body was twitching with the tail end of pure panic. When I was absolutely certain the creature wasn't coming back outside, I climbed down from the train on legs that felt like jelly. I turned toward the tunnel entrance with grim determination,